Hello, and welcome to Virtual DDDs, Stories on Facilitating Software Design and Architecture. Today, we're here with Simon, who's going to tell us a story. As usual, I'm here with my co-conspirators, Kenny and Andrew. So Simon, please take it away. Tell us a story about how you facilitated software design and architecture.
Gosh. First of all, thank you ever so much for inviting me to the show. Hopefully the video and the sound is all okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give a story about the process of how do you decide what to build, what to buy, what maybe to outsource, because normally there's lots of arguments and lots of discussion over this and lots of methodologies and techniques. So I'm going to give a story about that, and I'm going to do it in a heavy engineering subject. So we're going to use high-speed rail, and I've got a bunch of slides. So I'm going to put those up so you can record them, and if you put them on YouTube, you can use those there. But obviously, I'm mindful that a lot of this will be audio podcasts, so I'll do a lot of description as we go. Okay? So let me first share my screen. Entire screen. There we are. And the picture of a train, because we're talking about high-speed rail, which is heavy engineering. It's trains across the UK. And a picture of a good friend of mine, James Finley, who's was the CIO for HS2. Okay. So James had a problem. And James's problem was they needed to build the railway in a virtual world. And the reason why you build a railway in a virtual world before you build the physical railway is because it's cheaper to mess up a virtual landscape than it is the English countryside. So you want to start off by modeling, what this stuff is going to look like. And so James had this project, and the first thing they did is they graphed out, which is fairly typical, the sort of components involved in building such a system. So you have different types of users. You had the architects who want to visually see, almost like virtual headsets, walk through to see where the train is going, where the tracks are going. And of course, that requires some sort of geographical information system, which of course the engineers use. And of course, it's not procedurally generated. It's it's the English countryside. So you've got to have land registry in there. You need to know all the different components like the tracks and all the supporting infrastructure. So there's a lot of different resources we need to know. You've got a project information management system, so when things are being built, where they're being built, etc. And then you've got risk management systems. So there's loads of different components involved in building a virtual image of basically the railway. And of course, then there's the website, so people can have a look at it and see where the tracks are actually going. Now, the typical way we'd go about doing this is with contract structures, and this was back in 2012, is you normally clip together various components which had a common domain. Some of them would be engineering, some of them would be back office, some of them would be infrastructure. And then typically government would outsource it to different partners. And they would go and build it and build the interfaces and mostly suffer from massive cost overruns and failures. And so this was fairly normal. And James didn't want to do it that way. He thought there was something wrong with the way in which we went around contracts. So he spent Sunday afternoon, and he's an old friend, so I taught him how to map many years beforehand. And so we spent Sunday afternoon mapping out the actual space. So what you've got to think of, normally we would have some sort of graph or architectural diagram of the components involved and some sort of way of grouping them into sort of block structures, we call. And James said, well, let's not start with a graph, let's start with a map. And so we spent Sunday afternoon building. But I better, for the people just listening, explain what a map is. So you start by focusing on who the users are. once you've got an idea of the users, you think about what their needs are. And so, for example, engineers need access to the geographical information system. And then you start thinking about, well, what does a GIS actually need? Well, in this case, it's project information, land referencing information, a number of different components. And so you build the graph of the components. So you've got the users at the top, a chain of needs underneath. And then to turn it into a map, you simply go and ask a question about how evolved the various components are. And you map it across an axis of Genesis novel, a new custom-built examples, products, and then sort of commodity, utility, rental services. So if you think about that graph of components, at the bottom you might have things like data centers, you might have power, you might have compute. Well, compute's very much a commodity. Power is very, very much a commodity. But when you're talking about like land referencing or land registry type systems, they're much more custom. And so what happened is he spent an afternoon, he mapped this out and he sent me them. And I took the map and challenged him a little bit on them. And challenge is an important part of mapping. So normally people tend to run organizations with stories. And the problem with stories is we tell everybody that great leaders are great storytellers. So when you challenge somebody's story, you're challenging their leadership ability. And so people are defensive. One of the beauties about getting the story on a map is I don't challenge the person, I challenge the map. I'm saying the map is. So it's much easier to have those sorts of discussions. So I was able to challenge his map a bit and we modified. Now, James's problem was, how do I manage this environment? Well, one of the things you learn with maps is that all the components are evolving. So this is one of the patterns that. So everything which starts in Genesis evolves over time through custom, then product and convergence. So it's all moving from uncharted space to very industrialized. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about 3D visualization or land registry or compute, they all follow. And one of the things I'd learned back in 2006, another pattern, was that there's no such thing as one-size-fits-all methodologies. Doesn't matter whether I'm talking about project management or whether I'm talking about financing a system. So I'd learned that Agile, extreme programming, was very good on the left-hand side of the map in the uncharted space, the Genesis custom built, because it's good at reducing the cost of change. And changes are not. So when you're talking about something novel and new, it's going to change a lot. So you want methods which are good at reducing the cost of change. Whereas as the components evolve, you need, methods which are good at reducing deviation, because with a commodity, you want the same thing over and over and over again. So things like techniques like Six Sigma and outsourcing comes to the fore. In the middle, you're all about learning and reducing waste. So things like Lean, Scrum, MVP, all that sort of stuff come to the fore. So I'd learned back in 2006, you use multiple methods. So if I apply that to a map, what you discover is on the left-hand side of the map, you should be building probably in-house with Agile techniques. More in the middle of the map, you should be using off-the-shelf products, techniques like Lean. Whereas on the right-hand side of the map, you should probably be thinking about outsourcing to utility providers. If they don't exist, if you're building, this is where things like Six Sigma come into. So what you learn is you have to use appropriate methods. And so that's another pattern that you learn. You learn that things like everything evolves. You learn, there's no such thing as one size fits all. You learn you need to use appropriate methods. And so this was a discussion that I had with James. And once he had the map, of course, he took it back to his team. They challenged it more, made some more variations, because that's the point of a map. It's a way of discussing that space. And they ended up building it. And they built it ahead of schedule, under budget, which was pretty remarkable for a big sort of engineering project set within government. And they used multiple methods at the same time. Now, of course, I often tell this story at various conferences. And if I go to an Agile conference and I say, Agile has a place to be used, but it's not appropriate everywhere, well, people tend to go burn him Heretic. But I can go to Six Sigma conference, tell the same story, and say Six Sigma has the place where it's appropriate, but it's not useful everywhere. And of course, they get burning as well. It's, Scaled Agile Framework is one of these frameworks which believes it's useful everywhere. It has a context. If I turn up there and say, it has a place in Heretic, we have a lot of, sort of let's one size fits all. That's the way we should do it. I would always argue, let's understand the context, the environment, and then apply appropriate methods to it. And you can do this in, if you take a map of the environment, it's a fairly painless process because we can have a discussion about how evolved the components are. And once we've got that idea, then we can start to select appropriate methods. And I suppose that's my story, my story of conflict. I hope that was interesting and maybe useful.
Yes, thanks. I think it's a interesting one. What we always say is start mapping it so the conflicts will be on the map, the model, or whatever you call it, and not between people. My first question is what I often see people ask is, how do you go about when people actually don't start modeling? So you're in a situation, it's anarchy, let's say it's anarchy, and people just start. I'm from the Netherlands, so usually it's just they're starting to discuss without mapping it. What's your approach to, hold on, let's start visualizing this? I know a lot of people struggle with that.
No, oh, right. I think I have a few more slides actually, which, oh, no. I wait. I'll just use, I'll do this verbally. First of all, I don't think there's normally chaos. I think there's often, the issue is that there is order. And so there's order, as in we're going to use, I don't know, Agile everywhere, or we're going to use, this is our defined methodology and the one methodology which we're going to use. And so that's your first problem. And normally in these environments, you have typically lots of history of lots of past failure. And it's interesting because if you map out the environment, you try and work out, why is this stuff failing? Why are we having this problem? And mostly it's because when we break our contracts into lots, we have multiple different components of different types. So we might have a Genesis, custom built, product, and commodity component all in the same contract. But we're not mapping the environment, so we're not aware of this. And so when we outsource it, we try to, or we give it to somebody else with a contract, we try to define what the problem is. And we can easily define commodities and late products, but not so good on the Genesis custom because we don't know what we want. It's going to change. But by putting it into a contract structure, we almost guarantee we're going to have cost overruns. And we'll get into a fight with the vendor, and the vendor will say, well, look at all the bits we delivered successfully, all the product, commodity stuff, and all the costs are associated with these components, the Genesis custom built. And they will argue that the cost came from we didn't know what we wanted. Well, we can't know what we want. Okay? We should have used a different method. The worst thing that happens is somebody on your side says, next time we need to specify it better. Because you can't specify it better. That's the problem. It's the methodology. So often in organizations, our issue isn't so much chaos. It's too much order, too much attempt to the one size fits all, whether it's, we have a very structured method, or we're going to use Agile, which again is a structured method, but more designed for sort of Genesis custom built. We use Agile everywhere. So there is a lack of context. So how do you persuade people that looking at the environment is important? Well, in case of James's case, he'd been through enough government projects and seen enough failure. He was looking for something else to do. Okay. And fortunately, he has a military background. He used to be in the Navy. And one of the huge advantages of people with military backgrounds is they are taught about situational awareness. It's really, really important to understand your landscape and to understand the context. Anybody with military background knows how important maps are and knows why it's important to understand the situation. So, when you show somebody a map of a system, it becomes fairly easy for them to understand what it is, why it's important, why you should use different methods. Of course, if you have somebody who doesn't have that sort of background, well, now you've got another problem because you've got a technique of mapping, but you've first of all got to persuade them that looking at their environment matters. And these can often be people who've come through environments where they've been taught the one size magic. This is our chosen approach with no context, no anything. And that's a difficult sell. And it's difficult because if somebody's been doing a job for 20 years with their one size fits all method, it doesn't matter how much disaster they've gone through. And there's always excuses and reasons like we didn't specify it well enough. And you turn up and say, actually, it'd be useful looking at the context. Well, that's almost like saying you've been doing it wrong for the last 20 years, which they have. Okay. But, if they're senior, they're not going to want to hear that. Yeah, I'm afraid it's a tough one. It really is a tough one. It helps if you've got people with a military background, but you have to start by first explaining to people why looking at the environment might be important. And of course, that's really tough because if they've been in that role for a long time, it's like, oh my gosh, what are you be doing it wrong?
I
So
have
it's got
a
one.
related
So-
question there, Simon. And that is to do with, for example, I think everyone in this meeting is quite acquainted with teaching and modeling techniques. I think all of us are kind of quite practiced on that. And one of the things that I find
Yep.
it helps sometimes is show, don't tell. It's like, we're going to do this thing, or don't even tell what we're doing. It's like,
Yep.
okay. So, and you start mapping as a way to map. You're like, I can understand that. I'm slightly really visual, and you do it. The thing is that we have the advantage of having experience, and you can't get
Yep.
good at mapping without mapping. And I think that's the practice bit is where I have is my question for you, which is, how do we help people get better at practicing a skill that sometimes they are like, I can maybe see how this might be useful, but I don't want to invest multiple hours to find out. So it's hard for you because you have done a lot of mapping, but at some point you didn't do a lot of mapping. So maybe what would you suggest there?
Yes. So, okay. Well, my story was I was running a company and I realized over time that we had loads of things called maps in the company, but none of them were maps. They're all graphs. And I realized that understanding your landscape was important. Now, it was easy for me because I was running the company. And as soon as I realized we had no maps and I understood how important understanding the landscape was, then I spent about a year developing a way of mapping outer space, and that's what became Wardley mapping. And of course, I've been doing this for 20 odd years, and I use it everywhere from organizational structures to strategy to all sorts of different spaces. So it's easy for me. But again, it's a problem of explaining to others, and explaining to others is a bit like playing guitar. You can't read a book on playing a guitar and pick up and be Jimi Hendrix. You actually have to get your hands on the instrument. So you have to practice at some point. So Andrea, you came along. I often do these little research groups where we'll go and map different areas, like we'll map healthcare or we'll map construction or we'll map, recently we did space. And you were involved in the transport one. Transport.
Oh, yeah.
How'd you come
I knew
mapping
about Wardley
beforehand?
mapping, and I just kind of
you
wanted to
had.
see how other people do it for not systems. So my main quest was it was a deliberate practice exercise for me.
Okay, so the transport one was really interesting because it was during that, because we had some transport planners from all around the world, including some
Australia
people
as well.
in Budapest. And it was interesting, and Australia, of course. And it was interesting because there was a realization in that through the mapping that the internet itself was actually a transport system, which impact other transport systems. I don't know how familiar other people were, but certainly for some of the transport planners, this was quite a big revelation, because when they're thinking about congestion, they're thinking about in terms of roads and rail, but actually you've got to think of the internet as a transport system as well. So it was lovely to see that sort of discussion. And several of the people of the group were unfamiliar with the technique. And so it was that was a process of them seeing it being applied, being involved in the discussion, being able to challenge the components for a topic or domain that was important to them. And so that's why I like doing those things, and why I get to see groups now using it in healthcare and other spaces. But if you could certainly, if you're within an organization and you're dealing with a problem, suggest to people, hey, why don't we give this a go and sit down and just have a map? Because maps are imperfect representations. Let's spend a couple of hours, see what comes out of it. The only word of caution I would give is that maps tend to get people fired in organizations. Sorry, so that happens quite a lot. Because what happens in the process of mapping it out, things come out about what we're often doing. And if you're not careful, that can tread on political toes. So I normally go into organizations trying to speak at a high level about why situational awareness matters, encourage them to get groups of people just to have a look at a problem and to practice it. You can do that lower down the organization. Just be careful, only because politics comes into play, unfortunately.
It reminds me a bit of, sorry, Andrew, one learning before you ask. It reminds me a bit of The Anxiety of Learning by Edgar H. Schein.
Mm-hmm.
He tells there's two anxieties for people. One anxiety is, I think, survival anxiety. That's the simple one, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get fired anxiety. And he talks about a different anxiety, survival anxiety, learning anxiety and survival. So the survival one is thou shalt learn, else get fired. But that's not durable. The learning anxiety is supposed to be durable. So this is something you cannot change individually. It's an organizational thing, right? But how can I make learning anxiety as low as possible, lower than the survival one? And then people might be interested in. So it's an interesting article like that. This conversation reminded me of that.
The only thing I would say is that in organizations they often have their set procedures, the set ways of doing things. And even though they are continuously having failures and cost overruns, they continue to reapply the same processes, often with the same set of excuses. And the typical one I see is we didn't specify the problem well enough. Well, the reality is you can't specify the problem well enough. You have to use multiple methods. One which is adaptable to constantly changing environment we don't poorly understand, and ones which can be highly structured and defined. But we don't do that because we don't understand the context. So we want our structured and highly defined, whichever one we choose. And so it's going to impact us elsewhere. And so we can either, we do it in the two extremes, like almost like Six Sigma stroke, outsource too much, or we go the other way and we do agile everything, which again is not a good idea. So the problem, almost all these problems stem from a lack of awareness of the context of the problem that we're doing. And we just don't have the tools. And the thing is, when you tell people how to do it, that does undermine what they've been doing for the last 20 to 30 years. So just be mindful.
That's what I was going to ask about, Simon, actually, because how often do you see people, so things I see a lot are people weaponizing, because to get a really good map with a lot of context, you need, hopefully people come together and share their individual context and you build them together to make this map. How often do you see people weaponizing, not sharing the information that is, you've mapped everything else, you think this can't be, it doesn't feel like this node on the graph is in the right place. It feels like maybe if we were getting more information, it would be different, or maybe this is a bigger problem or something. How often do you see that?
So there's a technique that I use in the research groups when I'm about to do one on quantum computing. I've done ones on AI, like this. So that one of the techniques I use is when you map a space. So imagine that no one's mapped Paris. If you send a group out to map Paris and they come back with a map and you ask them what's important, they might tell you Pierre's Pizza Parlor because they've mapped Paris from a perspective of where to eat nice pizzas. So what you need to do is send groups out to map from multiple different perspectives, and then you can aggregate. So what I did this with the AI research project, about 60, 70 people, and we mapped out AI, but we broke into 7 different groups. And so we produced 7 different maps from 7 different perspectives, and we chose those themes beforehand. And then we can aggregate across all those maps to find what really matters. So the interesting thing about people using it politically and trying to push the conversation in a particular direction is you've diluted their voices, because I break them into 7 different groups, so they're within one group. So yes, they can highly influence the map of Paris over here, but there's 6 other maps of Paris. And what we're looking for is the commonalities, the aggregated effects. So the Eiffel Tower, you might have hidden the Eiffel Tower in your map because you want to keep it secret. Well, tough. It's appeared in the other 6 maps, so it sticks out like a sore thumb. So that's a general technique that I use now, is to take a large enough group and I reduce the time. So if we map an entire industry, we'll do it within 12 hours. We're about to do quantum. We'll do it over 3 weeks, 12 hours, 6 sessions of 2 hours. That's all it takes. And we'll take the people and we'll break them into multiple groups. And that's partially to avoid the super powerful voices restricting information within there.
Yeah.
Because
but then you reintegrate with the larger group. So everyone's part of the integration.
Yeah, so basically once you produce all of the different maps, so they have in groups, you bring it all back together and we aggregate across all of them. And this is where all the things bubble out. So yes, you can certainly influence and hide the stuff that matters. I'm going to be evil. Information is power in your map. Yeah, but there's 5 or 6 other maps, and you weren't hiding it in those.
Yeah, because I see like my job is like trying to people hiding information is the big tripping point.
Yeah, but that's the. You will often get dominant personalities in a group, and if you want to get to the answer of what is there, you still need them to be involved in the group. But what you're doing is, by using several groups, is you can pick up the signals from all of them, and so it diminishes that voice, that power.
Yeah. Actually, that's what the advice process, Andrew, that you wrote about, right? With the ADRs as a transparent beacon, I see that works because you ask people to write it down. I actually had someone write an ADR and tag that person deliberately. Like, you can write here, right? But there will also be 6, 7 other people writing their advice. And
I'm currently experiencing weaponizing non-contribution, which I never thought I would see. But they're like, no, you've outed me, but I'm.
Yeah. That does happen. But again, what you want to do is you want to encourage safe challenge. So you want to get out of story world because
you want smart disagree, like you said, Simon, right? Like in the you don't want everyone.
But you want it on the maps, not personal. Yes. So my favorite example of this, you mentioned Edgar Schein, is I needed to produce a map of culture. I realized some time ago that culture wasn't one thing. It was many, many different components. And Kroeber, who anthropologist, famously said anthropologists have been arguing for 100 years and still can't agree what culture is. So I had all these books on culture saying this is what it is. And there's all the experts saying we can't even agree. And that's been going on for 150 years. And then Margaret Mead, she had said that language was part of culture. And that creates a problem. Because if it's part of culture, you won't be able to explain it completely within language alone. So I had this idea of mapping out culture. And in order to do so, I actually took 2 warring groups who couldn't agree on anything. And these were in the UK, and these were Brexiteers and Remainers. And these people couldn't agree in story form at all. But we could challenge and agree through the form of a map, but not in story. So they would all argue about the position of things on the map and everything else. And we got really good discussion going on. And as a result, we used Brexit as the sort of framing of this. They created quite a spectacular map of culture itself and all the components that were involved. We'd have got nowhere in story form. We're just shouting arguments all the time.
I think we have hit like a longer time than usual, and we have kind of gone through quite a bunch of things. There's always time for another story. I think, Andrew, it seems like you probably have a story for us soon. But on that note, Simon, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your story on creating and basically designing software. Thank you very much. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure. And thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, folks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.